page, honey. 689.
Okay, let's go and get started back on studying Jesus' heart by Rabbi Bakaya, and we've gotten to page 689, and we're still in the gate of self-accounting, chapter 3, and we're on point number 9 up in what?
Checking ourselves.
Checking ourselves.
Personal check.
Personal check. So, what he gave us, how many? Remember?
30.
At
least.
At least 30. In other words, he doesn't stop and say that's all they are, but at least there's 30 different ways that we should think about, give an account of ourselves. So number 9, he says, one should make an accounting with himself of the different ways of serving God. So this one is about what? How we account ourselves in our service of God. And determine. I mean, because somewhere along the line you got to come to a what?
Decision to do it.
Well, you got to come to a conclusion. You know, if you give an accounting, somewhere along the line you have to total it up and say, I'm either short or I'm what? I'm okay. And you make the determination whether he exerts himself in each area with its unique demands to the same degree that he would exert himself in the service of his human sovereign. Now, remember in Malachi, one of the prophets, Malachi is talking to the people. And he says, you know, you guys are bringing these sacrifices, but there's something wrong with them. What's wrong with them? No. With these, well, they probably had wrong intent, but they're talking about something physical, too. What was wrong with the offerings?
They weren't the best.
Weren't the best. They were blind, lame, right? Now, remember what he advises the people to do? His advice to the people is, why don't you try giving this to the governor? Take one of these and offer it to the king.
It puts you in jail or a dungeon.
You know, and he's talking about a physical king or a physical governor, right? So try taking these to a physical governor or king and see how they feel about this present that you're giving to them, right? So he's trying to make a point. And the point is, the same point that he's making here, if we look at our service to our, in our case, by the way, elected officials or government or laws that we have within our land, how much do we exert ourselves in keeping these or maintaining those? And it's the same idea, by the way. So he says, if we were charged by the king, now most of us don't really have any kind of connotation of what it means to have a king, because we haven't had a king since 1776, I believe it is. And so it's really difficult for us to understand about a king, although we can read about them, we can study about them. There were really good kings, you know, it's like studying in the Torah. There were some really good kings, and there were some really bad kings. When you have really good kings, really good things happen. When you have really bad kings, really bad things happen.
Proverbs say that when a good king rules, people rejoice. And
Yeah.
bad king rules,
People mourn. So, I mean, that's the way what happens. But he says, he's posing a question. If we were charged by the king, and he's talking about an earthly king, by the way, to perform a certain task calling for physical action, what will we do? He says he would spare no effort or energy. There is nothing he would not invest in his performance. Now, I suppose he's talking about a good king, because if he had a bad king, I'm not sure that we give all our best effort in doing something. But he says, if the task called for serious study, reflection, and counsel, he would marshal all his attention, discernment, understanding, and perception in order to work on it and comprehend it. In other words, if that works for the physical king, if we would put that much exertion into in energy into accomplishing the task that that he's gave us, Now, he said, if he were to praise and thank the king, whether in poetry or in prose, in writing or in speech, for a favor conferred upon him, or a kindness that has been shown him, he would bring to bear all the powers of expression at his disposal, withholding nothing from his repertoire of eloquence and fine rhetoric, metaphors and figures of speech, whether true or false, to celebrate the king. With his, I mean, y'all have got remember those original 1611 King James Bibles? Remember have you ever read the introduction?
In the first, yes.
You know, it's the dedication to the king. And, you know, you read about halfway through it and you're like, gee, King James must have been God.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, it seems that way. I mean, the way they go on about the guy, you know? And the guy that wrote it probably didn't really like him.
Probably was just a politician.
Yeah, just a politician. But you're not going to say anything bad about the king either, you know, at that point in time in history. The king had a way of removing people's heads if you spoke badly about the king. So he says, even if it's true or false, right? You did this in order to do what? To celebrate the king. If he were capable of communicating this with all his limbs and with his innermost being and outward appearance, he would do so. If he were capable of galvanizing heaven and earth and all that is in them to thank and praise the king out of his wish to convey to him his good feelings toward him, he would do so. Thus he would do, despite the weakness and insignificance of a human being and how swiftly his days end. In other words, the king doesn't live for what? Forever. Right? He's not an eternal being. He just doesn't live forever. But in spite of all that, right? In spite of all that, he's saying, and of course, if you go back in history and you look at some of the things that people wrote about the kings of their times, you would think that he was going to live forever. But he doesn't. But it was their way of paying respect and honor, and maybe getting the attention of the king in some way, you know. So he says, similarly, or at least, you know, if we understand this in relationship to an earthly king that is not going to live forever, this is how an intelligent individual should act in the service of God. And remember King David in one of his Psalms, he says, how are we to act? Keep this in mind, by the way. It actually kind of helps sometimes. How should we act? As if we are in the presence of the king at all times. In reality, guess what? We are. Okay, so if you really think about it, the next time you're about to do something that the king probably would not like, just remember, the king sees everything. He might be. So he's telling us in the same way, you know, of the earthly king, except now we're talking about a king that's what? An eternal king, a king that has no limits, no limitations of time, space, right? So he says, if we're an intelligent individual should act in the service of God, may be exalted when performing any act of service. Now he says what? Allow me to explain. Any act devoted to God necessarily belongs to one of the three categories. Duties of the heart alone. In other words, these are acts which can only be accomplished with what? With the intellect, thought. If we go to the Big Ten list, right? What's the very first commandment? What's the very first commandment?
To know.
And the Lord your God.
And the Lord your God. And
To know God.
and Maimonides says that's what?
To know God.
It's a positive commandment to know, believe, right? Well, can I do that physically? I can only do that how? Mentally, intellectually. And by the way, as we've looked in duties of the heart, and you read other material, sometimes what you find out is that what we believe, and I'm talking about a belief, not just that we believe it blindly, right? When I say believe, I'm talking about the Hebrew word emunah. And the best way to explain that is, I believe because of. Right? I believe because of. In other words, my belief is to be based and rooted in what? Some evidence, some facts. Reasoning, whether it's logical. You know, there's a lot of laws in the Torah that are just based on pure logic. I mean, you have to think about it, just pure logic. Right? If we come to the conclusion about a belief in God, right, first of all, we have to start working with what? Some facts. And then as we begin to define those facts, there are certain things that we come to the realization we can't go this way and it's going to work. So we have to decide on a way of knowing. Right? For example, since God is beyond space and time, that tells us He's what? Not physical. Because everything that's locked in space and time happens to be what? It happens to be created. At least we say it has a beginning. Right? I mean, it has a beginning. With God, He has what? No beginning. One of the words that you can use, by the way, is the word Ein Sof. Right? And you know what Ein Sof in Hebrew means? No. Ein Sof.
Timeless.
Well, you could maybe make that point, you know, but it's just the unknowable. Right? He's unknown. Ein Sof. The Ein Sof, until creation came into being, physical creation, he existed, but he existed as who? The Ein Sof. Right? Because there was nobody around to do what? To know him. And once creation came into existence, then he begins to do what? Be known. And the first way that we know that he can be known is through his creation, his actions, creation. We know in Genesis, for example, in Bereshit, what's the very first thing that he chooses to tell us about himself?
That he was. In the beginning, he was.
I mean, there's a lot of things when you really start, but the very first thing he does is give himself a name. Right? Now, it's not a name, you know, it's not his name, but it's a name that represents some activity. Now, Elohim, it can be translated judge. It can also be understood as all-powerful. Right? So we could say he's the all-powerful one. Or we can say that, in fact, for creation, it has a connotation of justice and judgment. So everything that was created with a sense of justice. Now, when I say a sense of justice, it was created with laws. So when we talk about justice or judgment, we're talking about God created things with laws, and based on those laws, things are going to continue to go that way. You know, for example, when certain birds were made, they built their nests in a certain way. And guess what? They're still building their nests exactly the same way. They don't change. You know, a cow don't decide one day I'm going to be a sheep, right, or goat. They're just cows, and they do what cows do. They don't change. When we think about the weather, for example, we know today from the study of climatic change what it takes to make climatic changes. We know what it takes to make hurricanes. We know what it takes to make tornadoes, right? Because we've studied the weather patterns, and when a weather pattern presents itself in the manner that we have learned, we expect to see what?
We know that.
We expect to see the outcome, because now we understand cause and effect. And we work with that all the time. It's what we work with.
It's not that they're predicting the weather.
Huh?
So it's not that they are predicting the weather from scientific fact.
Right. Well, you know, if you can take cold air and hot air in the right mixture and introduce it into a scientific lab, and then when you introduce it, you get a tornado time after time after time. It's pretty simple after that point. If you have that hot and cold air mixing together at a central point, when it comes together, it's probably going to produce a good chance that it's going to produce a tornado. Doesn't mean that it will, but there's a good chance that it will. At least it's going to produce some kind of storm. So, without those laws, how could we understand? You know, things don't go outside their boundaries of laws. Now, if it rains, where's the rain go out?
Into the ground.
Into the ground, or, well, eventually, right? But it'll go into the rivers. The rivers go where?
To the ocean.
To the ocean.
Ocean goes back in the air.
And from the ocean. I mean, you can stand on the seashore, right? And you can see the sun come up over the ocean, and a lot of times you can see what?
Mist go around it.
Boom. Where's it going? The heat from the sun is just making the water do what? Comes right back into the air.
Changing its form into vapor, making it lighter than air.
Exactly. And when it attaches itself to oxygen, you know, it becomes that molecule that we know as H2O. But these are patterns that we know. Now, and by the way, I'm not telling you anything new. This is the pattern that King Solomon talks about in the book of Ecclesiastes. He tells you about this pattern. You know, the rain falls, you know, and the question becomes, we don't ever run out of it. Huh? Why don't we ever run out of rain? That's a good question.
Those are the cycles.
And if we don't run out of rain, what's the other question is, if it doesn't cycle and we continually get rain, why is not the earth flooded with rain, with water? Right? So we know these laws. We know how they work. Solomon knew how they work. He's telling us. But it's making us question these things, right? So it's this all-powerful one, the one that we must reach some conclusions about. Right? So how do we do that? We do it with our intellect. Now, his Ein Sof, he's just unknowable. But when creation comes into being, then we can begin to not know him, but we can begin to know some of his what? His ways. The way he acts. Okay, for example, the way he creates. We learn from creation the way he creates things. He creates things with what? With boundaries, with laws. What was the very first thing that God did as soon as he makes man? Gave him laws. Gave him boundaries. Pretty simple, but he gave him boundaries, didn't he? I mean, the very first thing. And so you see that time after time. Everything that God brought into being was brought in by the strict guidelines of boundaries. Every day. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. So what can we learn from that, from his activities? Right? So he took things from a place of chaos and gave them what? Order. So what kind of idea do I get about God from that?
He's an orderly God.
He likes things in what? He likes things in order.
Function in a specific way.
Exactly. So you kind of, you draw some information. And that too. But that's the point, Joe. You have to go back and you have to say, okay, not the fact that I just say there's a God and that I have this certain belief that there is, right? And then you got to ask the question, how many are there? There are 1, 2, 3, 1,000? You know? If you want to go back to the Greeks and the Romans, they had what? How many? Many. Because they had a deity that ruled over
Every different thing.
thing.
And played games with people.
And then eventually, they had the big guy that supposedly ruled over them, which he really didn't rule over them too much because they were always disobedient to him and always doing things that supposedly he didn't want them to do. So he didn't have too much charge of them. He apparently wasn't too powerful.
Carried the right credit card.
Exactly.
Didn't have any clout.
Didn't have any clout at all. He must not have had American Express, huh?
That's right.
Or Visa.
That was before American Express was invented.
But they had a whole pantheon of gods. So how do we decide, is there a pantheon? Is there a deity that rules over each and little thing? Even Egypt had that idea about that. And so we got to decide how many gods were involved in this. And then we got to ask ourselves, if there were so many gods involved in it, then they all had to be what? Like-minded. Right? I mean, even in the Greeks and Roman pantheons, there was none of those what? Like-minded. It's like chaos, in some sense. Every once in a while, you might get one or two of them to actually cooperate with each other, but other than that, no. And so maybe from that we can, we come down to not only saying there's one, but we have to do what? We have to know there's one. We have to say there's one God because of. Right?
Well, I still say even in Greek and Roman times, they might have been, many gods, but they had to eventually answer to the ultimate one.
Well, everybody has to eventually offer to the ultimate one. It's just their ideas of it.
They didn't know that.
They didn't know that. In some sense, every society that had these deities always had a ultimate God, right? But they could not accept that there was a God that controlled everything. That there was this one all-powerful God. So they had to have these sub-deities that control the Nile or control the water, that control the animals. They had the goddess of love. All these different gods that control different things.
Lesser gods.
Lesser gods. We call the best way to do it is to refer to them as deities, and each deity had its own little area of expertise, and it couldn't operate outside that area of expertise. By the way, it had no influence outside of that. So they would make deals with each other so that they could cooperate sometimes to get things done. But they had one God always back behind them, but he didn't seem to be all powerful because he couldn't even control the sub-deities. Okay? So, yeah, whether they accepted the fact there's one, they're still going to be responsible when it comes to the day of judgment, by the way. So, a lot of things that we have to do, we just have to accomplish with our intellect. I mean, that's the way God intended for us to accomplish it. And so he says, duties of the heart alone, which are what we aim to explain in this book, right? And he's gave us all kinds of information so far about that. Number 2 is duties of the body and heart together. It's the way you can accomplish it. Such as prayer, right? Torah study, praising and glorifying God, teaching wisdom, enjoining right conduct, warning against evil, and the like. In other words, now you have to have not only the intellect, but in certain things you got to have what? The limbs. There's got to be some physical activity. Okay? Number 3 says, duties of the limbs alone, in which the heart has no part except for initially directing the act to God. Okay? Such as sukkah, This is the festival of what? Sukkot. You build a what? You build a booth. And it's interesting, by the way, that it's really not a mitzvah to build a booth. It's a mitzvah to be in it. Right? Lulav. You know what a lulav is? You remember? What do you do on the festival of Sukkot besides stay in a booth? When the temple, well, actually, even today in the synagogues, you do what? When you go to the synagogue. You still haven't told me what it is. You tell me what to do with it.
It's a branch.
What kind? Mixture of branches, right? What do you hold in one hand?
Lemon. Citron.
A big lemon, huh?
Citron.
An etrog.
I thought it was citron.
No, an etrog. A big lemon. Looks like a lemon, but it's not a lemon. It's an etrog. And a lulav is made up of branches. And when you go to prayer, and when the temple is standing, of course everybody would go to the temple, and you turn different directions, and you shake this lulav so many times, right?
What is lemon?
So that's really about physical activity,
I
right?
thought you waved it in 4 directions.
You do. I said you have to turn different
Oh,
directions.
waved this way and that way.
Well, this way and that way. And that other way, too. Tzitzits. They're what? The little strings with knots. You know, you have to do what? Physically tie those. And you got to physically do what? Put them on. Mezuzah. Everybody know what a mezuzah is? Well, the box on goes on the door. But it's not just the box that we're concerned about. It's about what? It has a little scroll inside it. That's, in fact, you could attach the scroll and not have the box. And what do you put the box in? Huh? So, why do you put the boxes up? Protect the scroll. You don't want the scroll being damaged. You know, has the name of God on it. So you put it inside the box, wrap it, and even before you put it inside the box, you wrap it in saran wrap today, and or plastic. You know, when you put it inside, it's just a protective case. Is all it is. You can actually just put the scroll itself up. So that's really the mezuzah. You just have the box. With that box, it's just what? Just a box, unless it has the scroll in it. He goes on to say, observing Shabbos and the festivals, giving charity, and similar ideas in which distraction by other thoughts does not harm the one who performs them. In other words, you can do these without doing what? Without really thinking about it. Now, he says, when engaged in the duties of the heart, one is obligated to clear his mind of worldly thoughts and cares and to devote his heart and inner consciousness to God alone. Now, even though prayer is done physically, and that what else? How else is it done? Mentally, intellectually, with our, right? What would be the appropriate thing to do before we begin to pray?
Clear our minds.
Clear our minds. Try to get some of the great sages, we're told, by the way, would take 3 hours to prepare for prayer. See, what were they doing? Clearing their mind. Yeah. Well, I'm sure it's some form of meditation. It's and we talked about in Hebrew it's called hipvot. You know, it's seemingly a form of meditation. King David talks about it, right? I don't know if they did it that way or not. But it's a fact that they did clear their minds before they began to pray. So in other words, you try to get all those worldly thoughts out of your mind, because why? Because you want to concentrate on, if you're going before the king, you want to go in there and just ramble about everything? Right? No, you want to talk directly to the king and precisely, be as precise in the language as you can. So you clear your mind of all these worldly thoughts, then you go in and you say what you need to say. So you clear your mind, he says, the worldly thoughts and cares. Well, it's hard to do. You ever try to do this, by the way? Very difficult to do. Because we keep having these little flashbacks.
Jump in your mind. You don't know where to come from.
Exactly. Because trying to clear our minds of everything that's worldly and all of our human cares, right? Trying to dismiss those just for a few moments is very difficult. It's very hard. But we should do this, by the way, and then devote our hearts and our inner consciousness to God alone. So it is told of one of the ascetics who would say in his prayers, my God, my sorrow for your sake has abolished all my other sorrows. My concern with you has driven from my soul all other concerns. As a result, God will accept one's service and be pleased with him. Now, I dare say that there's too many that arrive at the level that this gentleman arrived at. Right? But what is an ascetic? And is being an ascetic a good thing, by the way? According to Torah. Should you separate yourself from a community? Why should you?
God created us for to be part of a society.
Be part of a society, and there are certain things that that you can't do if you're not part of that society. If you're outside of that society, you're not given a chance to steal. It's easy not to be a thief. If you're just out there living in a cave all by yourself, right? I mean, you look at the social laws. Those social laws are what? Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit sexual incest. What if you're out there all by yourself living in a cave? You don't have opportunities to do any of those?
Not unless you do it to yourself.
Not unless you do it to yourself somehow. But that is the reality, that you don't have the opportunities to live as a human being, by the way. And you don't have the opportunities to overcome. One of the great lessons that we should understand is that, yes, Adam fell in the garden. Okay? He blew it. Him and his wife. But that falling in the garden only gave and presented an opportunity. Most people think, this is a horrible thing that Adam fell, right? And it is. We can say that. But on the other hand, was it a good thing too?
Presented unlimited opportunities.
Now we have an opportunity to do what? Well, a little bit more than that. What's the mitzvah about?
Come close to God.
Coming close to God. What else are we supposed to do? We talked about human history as opposed to, secular history as opposed to Jewish history. Secular history is a linear. It doesn't have a beginning and when's it going to end? So from a Jewish historical point of view, what's our perspective? Circular, right? We start in the garden. Where are we going? How do we get back there? What's the operation? What are we supposed to be doing? Perfecting. We call it tikkun. It's called rectification. Right? Now we have the grand privilege, by the way, of doing what? Of rectifying. How do we rectify things? What's this rectification about? How do we do it?
First, gotta have a little knowledge.
Got to have a little knowledge, good place to start, a little intellect, right? And then we have to know the mitzvahs, the commandments. And every time that we fulfill a mitzvah in the correct and proper procedure, guess what we've done? We've done a little bit closer. We got a little bit closer back, right? Because the violation of it is what happened to us. Now we're trying to rectify. It's called tikkun olam, rectification of the world, bringing everybody back. Because when Adam fell, what else fell with him?
Whole world.
The whole world. So the whole world needs what? Rectified. And the only being on the face of this earth that can bring about rectification is man. And he has to do that with his intellect, and he has to do it with his body, physically. When he physically keeps a commandment.
God created it. God gave man the ability to create it back again.
Exactly. You know, whatever the garden's all about, that's where we're supposed to get back to. And if you read about stuff in the garden, I mean, there's just certain things that you know. For example, what are you concerned about in the garden, Ira? What's the concern? I'll ask you this: what was Adam's concerns?
He had those real concerns. He had some challenges.
No real concerns, did he? Was he concerned about clothes? Was he run down to the Target or J.C. Penney's and say, "Look at me, I'm naked. I need some clothes."
For the Home Depot or those.
And he didn't run to Home Depot and say, "I don't have a place to live. I don't have a home. I got to build me a house."
He was on an all-expense paid vacation.
He was on an all-expense paid vacation. His only concern was knowledge. That was his only concern, was to gain knowledge. That was all. Everything else was what? Everything else was taken care of. He wasn't concerned about clothes. He wasn't concerned about keeping up with the Joneses or the Smiths. He wasn't concerned about any of that. Right? Now, I don't know about you guys, but I think the garden's a pretty good place. And that's our job, by the way. But if you think it's a pretty good place, you want to do what? You want to get back there. Now, in the world we live in, what are we doing? What do we expend? Over 90% of our energies, what do we expend it upon?
The material things here.
Getting things. I mean,
Taking care of things.
take care of things. Well, man, we got to have a home, right? We got to have some clothes. But then it's not just good enough just to have a home. We got to have
Certain home.
certain home,
Certain clothes.
certain clothes,
Certain wheels.
certain wheels, certain tires. You know, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy good things. You know, it's obvious that if you go out and buy something and you pay substantially the same price for it, and it wears out within 2 months, and you buy the other thing that's made better, and you might pay a little bit more, that it lasts a year substantially, you should buy that, you know, if you don't get tired of it and sell it in the yard sale for 25 cents later on. But we spend all of our energies on the least important things. If God had thought it was important for Adam to have clothes, right, for him to work to have clothes, and him to work to have a home, the first thing he would have done would have provided Adam with a way to make some money so he could buy some clothes and buy him a home. Didn't work. So we can really learn a lot about the garden and what it should be and why it should be our desire to get back there, because our whole effort of our lives that we spend a very short period of time on this earth is not what the original intention for Adam and us as human beings were to be.
It's so hard because the world has captured us in a sense, so we're all caught up in it.
We allow ourselves.
We captured it.
Yeah, we allow ourselves to be. Look, I see people building homes. I'll take it back. I see people building houses. Not homes, houses. There's a difference between a home and a house, if you know what I'm talking about. I see people building houses all the time. And some of the houses that they build, you've got two people that's going to live in this house, essentially. Right? Man and woman. They don't have any kids. And they build this monstrosity. I mean, 10, 15, 20 rooms, 10 baths, just unbelievable. Why?
Show off.
It's always got to be our. It can't be anything else. You know? And in our place, by the way, it's maybe to get ahead of the Joneses. And I'm really saying get ahead of the Joneses. Right? And that's just wasted what? Wasted effort, wasted resources, wasted time. Now, what if these men that are involved in this, by the way, what if they took the energy and the time and the resources and put it into study and mitzvot? How much would the world be different? Okay.
Heck of an impact, I'll tell you that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But that's what I'm saying is that we get caught up in a system that God never intended for us to get caught up in. Yes, we live in this world, and yes, we have to have clothes, and yes, we have to have a place to live. But then it gets to a place that if we expend our energy and our resources and our time doing nothing but obtain those things, then we have failed to do what God originally wanted us to do and continue to want us to do. To use our minds to gain knowledge. And mostly knowledge about who? About Him. And our relationship with Him, our closeness to Him. And it's not a spatial thing where I can run up and hug Him and say, oh, it's so great to know you. Because He's not physical. My closeness to Him is based on what I know He is not. And I can prove it. So if you go back to the garden and you look at Adam and you look at what he didn't have and what he didn't really care about, right? Because the very first thing it tells us, they were in a garden and they were naked. And guess what? They didn't care. They weren't concerned about it. Why? Because it wasn't relevant. Now, the very first thing that, by the way, after they fail, what's the very first thing that they're concerned about? Clothing.
Covering themselves.
Clothing. You got to cover themselves. And then God sees their concern, and guess what He does for them? He makes them some clothes, because those fig leaves wouldn't just work Him just right? So He makes them appropriate clothing for them. Probably wasn't Nikes or Adidas or... I'm sure they got some good animal hides, keep them warm. But my point is, if we go back to the garden, we see Adam, and the original intent for man was to develop his intellect, to gain knowledge, gain understanding, to gain wisdom, right? And that's all shifted. Now our energies and our time and our resources get put on things that was never the intention. And now we struggle to spend time developing our mind, looking into God's Torah and extracting those wonderful ideas. If we had David's mindset, I'm talking about King David, right? How would you view work and riches and fame How would you view those things? I'm talking about King David now.
Something that's expendable.
King David viewed it as pointless.
And even Solomon, that had everything, viewed it as what?
Pointless.
Futile.
Futile, temporary. You know, here today,
Vanity.
vanity. Here today, gone tomorrow. You know. On the other hand, if he looks at the Torah, what does he say about it? There's some interesting things. You know, if we go back and we did a study years ago in Psalm 119. Maybe we need to go back there one of these days. Better than gold and silver. Sweeter to the taste than what? Than honeycomb. Music. There was this music in the Torah, right? And when David wrote the Psalms, by the way, all he was doing was just regurgitating what was going on where? In his mind. All of his ways in one of his Psalms, he says, all the ways of the Torah is pleasantness. Now, if you take that system that David's talking about, it's pleasant, it's beautiful, it's music, it's worth more than any gold and silver that you could ever extract. Even the finest gold, it's beyond, it's priceless, is what King David is saying. If we took his analysis of the Torah, where should we be expending our time and resources? In Torah, right? Gaining knowledge. That's what God wants us to do. But yet we tend to do just the opposite of that. And by the way, believe it or not, one of these days when we do have an accountability before Him, we might be reminded of those facts. You know, what was my intention for you? Didn't you read what I allowed King David to write about my word? Didn't you understand what he talked about, this system that I gave to humanity, the beauty of it, the music that King David found within it, the richness, that it was beyond price, beyond measure, the wisdom that is to be had within it. And you just did what? You just slept it off. Right? So, it becomes our choice, by the way. You know, and the little time that we have on the face of this earth, some, of course, have a few more years than others, some have less, but our whole life should be spent. Our resources, our time should be expended on gathering what? Knowledge. Because when you leave this world, folks, you're going to take that home with you? That's all you're going to take with you. You can't take your automobiles. You can't take your money. You cannot take your clothes. Except maybe those you're buried in. But, you know, they stay where they're at. And eventually they do what? They eventually rot away. So you can't really take those. You take them as far as the ground. Maybe, if somebody puts you in some. But you can't take any of this. But what we can take is the most valuable. That's our knowledge. Our deeds that we've done because of our knowledge. That work hand in hand. And, you know, I guess the amazing part about most of this is that you, as you get older, I'm not old yet, but as you get older, as you get older, you realize this more and more. You know, when you're young and growing up, everything that's in your mind is just the opposite of what, as you get older, you find out. I should have spent time studying. I should have spent time doing more charitable work. I should have spent time doing more commandments. I should have studied harder. I should have done this. I should have done that. But when you're young, all you can see is what you want. And how do I get it? And you want the clothes. And as you get a little bit older, you want the automobiles. You get a little bit older, you want the the home, you know, and you want one bigger than the next guy and better than the next guy. And you wind up doing nothing but spending your whole life in debt, trying to pay for the bigger and the best. Whereas if you just learn to live a very simplistic life, you're a lot better off. I mean, a lot better off. You're better off mentally, by the way. You know why? Because if somebody lives in a huge home and it's this big, beautiful monstrosity, you know what they can do in their home that you can't do in your home? What can they do in their home that you can't do in your little small home?
Run bigger circles.
Run bigger circles. I eat in my home. Right? They eat. And I eat better, but I eat. They sleep. And if they have indoor plumbing, they can use the bathroom and take a shower or a bath, you know. But when it comes right down to it, the basic things, they can't do anything more than what you can in a small home or as opposed to a big home. Can't do it. But the simple life for people, I'm telling you, is the best life because you're not in competition with people all the time. And you'll spend most of your energies, by the way, on the things that are most important, and that's wisdom and gaining knowledge and understanding. Because you won't be in debt up to your eyeballs having to go out and work 2 or 3 jobs just to stay on even keel. And that's where most of our people in our society are at today. They've killed themselves. They put themselves in debt so much that they, if they miss 1 week paycheck, they've had it. And if you don't believe that, look at what's happening in our housing building stuff right now. I mean, home sales. All these people bought all these homes. You know, I mean, I go out, I work, and I go out and see these people all the day long. Young people, right? And they bought $175,000, $200,000 home. Right? Now, several years ago, that would have been a heck of a home, but it's kind of an average home today. $175,000, $200,000 home. But they've got 2 new automobiles sitting outside. And a boat. Right? Now, on that kind of home, you know how much the equity is on that? I mean, not the equity, but the payment is? Even the low interest rates that we have today.
$1,500.
Usually got 1% of whatever their loan value is.
Exactly. Today it is. You know, it used to be a little bit higher than that because the loan interest was up so high. So you're looking at $1,000 a month payment. Minimum. We'll say minimum on that, right? Then those 2 new cars they got, that's probably another $1,000. Now, and that's not counting just the basics. You got to have electricity, and you got to have water. You got to have food, and just a little bit of furniture goes in the house, you know. And of course, they're not going to have just any furniture. It's going to be used, nice furniture. And guess what they usually wind up doing on that?
Payments.
And what about that credit card that they got from in the mail with no collateral or anything on it?
High interest rates.
With a tremendous high interest rate because of the risk that's involved, and they go out and buy it. And all of a sudden they've got $10,000 in debt on a credit card, and they're just barely making the interest payment every month on it. They're not hitting anything on the balance, and the interest keeps piling up and piling up. And sooner or later, if one of them happens to miss a week or 2 of work, you know what else they miss? Some payments. Because everything is based on the fact that they work every week and a certain amount of money comes in every week. Because they planned it out down to the penny. The only problem is they don't plan for any problems. Nothing extra. But that's where we're at in our society, and that's the mindset. You know, we want things. We've always said, which I think has kind of got our next generation in trouble. We always want our kids to have better than what we have. I don't. I want them to have a good life. I don't care that they have things or not. If they have things, that's fine. I want them to have a good life. Actually, I'd like for them to have a real simple life. That they'd realize that the greatest thing that they can ever gain in this world is knowledge of their Creator. Right? Because that's the only thing they can take with them. All their clothes, all their fine homes, and all their nice automobiles. And it's going to stay here. Somebody else is going to get it. Somebody else is going to use it along the way. You know, and whatever that big bank account that they might have, if you die, somebody will take it and spend it. And if there's nobody around to inherit it, guess who gets it? State, government, they'll take it. And they don't care how they spend it. They'll throw it away. They do a good job of that. They've about thrown us into the death so far that we'll never climb back out. But that's the government. They spend money they don't have. And it's the same way with us. Guess what we've learned? We spend money we don't have. That's why you have a credit card. Okay. So I guess I'm harping too much on that. But I don't think I am. I think the reality is that as a young man myself, I realized, I wanted things. And I put a lot of resource and a lot of expenditure into having things. As I got older and really became a little bit more God consciousness, I realized it's expendable. It can be here today and gone tomorrow. We could drive home. Be driving back to our homes after sitting here and having our classes and studying. And when we got home, guess what we could see? A little rubble of smoke. It can be what? Gone. Or there could be just one of those fluke tornadoes come through, and guess what? Gone. We have the old saying, what, here today, gone tomorrow. But it can be here today and gone today. It can be here today and gone in a moment. We don't know. And then, where are we at?
Sitting out in the yard crying.
Sitting out in the yard crying. If all of our self is entangled in that, we're going to be sitting in the yard crying. If our self's not entangled in that, we can say,
okay, let's go on.
Yeah, you can say, thank God I wasn't in there when that happened. Thank God that nobody got hurt. Nobody was killed. Nobody was harmed.
Okay, Lord, what's next?
Well, we submit kind of to the idea like Job, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord. I mean, that's the way that we have to look at things. And sometimes maybe God's got something bigger and better for us, and sometimes maybe He just got something smaller for us. Doesn't work bigger and better always, by the way. So if we think in these terms, then we should be expending our greatest energy in gaining knowledge of Him, doing mitzvahs, because the whole point is that we want to get back to the garden. Because back in the garden, you don't have any of these concerns. You're not worried about clothes. You're not worried about a house, a place. The only thing that concerns you in the garden is knowledge. Gaining knowledge. So that should be our major what? Concern today. And our energy, our resources, all of our efforts that we have, that should be working here today. And we usually do just the opposite. And our society, as I say, has become so materialistic that they really forgot the real simple stuff. There's a few people that still live simple lives and they understand the most important thing. But you know what we say about those people? There's something wrong with them. What's
they understand.
Yeah, well, why they live, why they live like, why they dress like that, why they live like that? Huh?
God really does.
Absolutely, the problem is for us. That is the real problem. It's not them.
They've got it figured out.
They got it figured out. We don't. And we're still sitting around saying, what's wrong with them folks?
Scratching their head.
What we should be saying is, what's wrong with this folk? Right? Okay. Let's stop right here, and we'll pick back up in our study views of heart on page 691. So everybody that listens to this, by the way, can't go away saying they haven't been warned. That and myself included, by the way, that when we stand before King of the universe, and he's going to say, well, you know, I gave you all that stuff, but you didn't use it very wisely. You could have done a lot more for it. You squandered it on useless stuff. You squandered it on yourself, selfishly. Okay? Any questions or comments of what we've done so far? Okay.
I just, out of curiosity, I'm just saying, if we make it back to the garden,
Right.
will the laws that we have today still be the same as in the garden? And if they are the same, will they be, as far as like the reward and punishment part, will they be just the same or be more adequate?
No. When it's over, and when you're going back to the garden, don't worry about laws. There will be no laws.
You don't think it's a spiritual law?
You'll be doing what you're supposed to do. The only thing you can do in the garden, gain knowledge. That's all. The Torah, and this is my perspective, this is Jack Saunders, but not just Jack Saunders, with other people, by the way. The Torah existed prior to creation. Right? Because it says God looked into His Torah and created the world. What does that mean?
Torah pre-existed.
Torah pre-existed. Now that tells me the Torah is not something that's what?
Created.
Not created. It always was. Always was in some sense. So if it pre-existed, what form did it pre-exist in?
Spiritual.
In a different form than we know it today.
Is that when they say God took Torah and Israel was born?
Yes. So it existed, but it existed in a different form. So what we understand, when we read something in the Torah today that says you have to do this physically, there's a spiritual connotation that goes with that physical act. Remember we said our problem is due to tune.
Oh, well, I understand that. Yeah.
So if you do something physically here, you're actually doing spiritual repair in the other world.
Yeah, I understand that.
Okay. Well, that's about it. So when you get back to the garden, is there going to be any kind of physical laws? No, because there's nothing physical there.
Or again, the spiritual part?
If the spiritual law was controlling, then be no problem with the physical anyway.
Exactly. No.
But what I was saying though is the laws that we have today. I mean, you know, they were meant for the physical world.
Yes.
When we get to the garden, if we make it to the garden, are those laws pretty much just going to be abolished and new laws be rewritten, or?
No, they'll be the same laws, but they'll be not physical anymore. We'll understand the spiritual meaning behind those laws.
Also, they'll still be the same laws.
But you won't be doing them physical anymore because you're not going to be physical anymore.
Oh, okay.
The process of the
I've been reading that
evolution.
part. I've been, reading that a little bit, and I was under the impression that, once we got back to the garden, that we would have new laws.
No, not new laws.
That
Yeah, they'll be the same laws, but they're not physical anymore. In other words, you're not physical. Therefore, You can't physically do things anymore, but the laws of the Torah are going to be the same, but they're going to be on a different level of your understanding of those laws is going to be on a different level of understanding.
The process that you'd have to go through to get back there would take care of all that.
We hope.
If you don't get back, if you don't go through
Yeah, if you don't get back,
the
you don't go through
process.
all that, right? But that's where it begins, or at least where we should begin. And we work at that here and now, mentally, and then we have to do physical things. But as we do the physical things, we should be learning what does that mean in the other realm. What is this physical act, and what's it accomplishing in the other realm? What repair am I doing? What am I helping?
Just doing the same.
Or am I doing something horrible that's preventing the repair of the world? Okay? Answer? Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll pick up right here on page 691 in Didi's Heart, our continuing study by Rabbi Bakaya.